Greetings, I'm Roberto Valdez, Master of the Science of Geography and Instructor of History at Northern New Mexico College in Española, New Mexico. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the earliest migration of human beings into the American Southwest, also known as El Norte Mexicano. The end of the Ice Age introduced great changes to life on Earth. Sea levels were lower, and human beings hunted and fished their way into North America. In this imagery provided by Google Earth, I have laid out for you some of the sites that we will be visiting. We will be looking at this place called Blackwater Draw. Let me zoom into it so you can see. It's in eastern state of New Mexico on what they call the flat plains of the Llano Estacado. It is also known as the Clovis site. The Clovis site. To the northeast, we will be visiting the Folsom Kill site near Folsom, New Mexico. Kill sites involve artifacts such as spear points, which are made of flint. Keep in mind that flint supplies could have come from a place like this, Alabate's Flint Quarries, in what is today Texas. We will also be visiting in the Tularosa Valley, east of Las Cruces, and south of Alamogordo, a place called Oro Grande, the Oro Grande site. It is here labeled Pendejo Cave. We will also be visiting another site near Albuquerque or Albuquerque, south of the Española Valley, south of Santa Fe, a place called the Sandia Cave site. First, our learning objectives. At the conclusion of this lecture, I hope you will better understand who the earliest migrants to the Americas were, hypotheses and theories about where they came from, routes they took, and at what times. I want you to see how early Americans sustained themselves by hunting, gathering, fishing, and scavenging, and discover how extinct species of animals once existed. I want you to know what the Holocene epoch is. It's a time period that is characterized by the end of the Ice Age. We will see early human occupation or kill sites in the state of New Mexico known as the Clovis, Folsom, Oro Grande, and Sandia Cave sites that we saw in the previous frame. Early evidence of humankind in New Mexico was discovered near Clovis, New Mexico, and Folsom, New Mexico. New Mexico has the distinction of being the region where scientists made what was then the earliest discoveries of people in North America. First, let me introduce you to the name for these early migrants into the Americas. They are known as the Paleolithic Indians, or Paleolithic people. The word Paleolithic is composed of the words Palaios, meaning old, and it's from the Greek, and lithos, meaning stone, also from the Greek. These are people who were living in the Americas from before 12,000 years ago to about 7,000 BC or 9,000 years ago. This was the time of the megafauna, when creatures were huge. Many different unusual and now extinct species of mammals were much larger than they are today. While all bigger mammals need food to feed themselves pound for pound, they needed less food to eat. Another advantage is that larger creatures can keep themselves warmer. Long ago in East Asia, humans grouped together in bands and practiced one of the most advantageous aspects of being human, and that is cooperation. It required cooperation to bring down large creatures. The Ice Age was concluding and humans followed their quarry, or animals they hunted. However, it was very likely that early humans in the Americas hunted smaller creatures like these reindeer. The ancestors of a present-day people of Siberia known as the Chukchi domesticated reindeer. Today, a small number continue this nomadic way of life, living in a kind of hut called a yaranga that they move with them to new pastures. They herd reindeer in the Arctic region of Siberia, where the reindeer feed on lichen upon the tundra. During prehistoric time, many people engaged in less glorious procurement activities like scavenging, gathering fruits and roots, and fishing. The earliest people arriving in North America came from Siberia, presently part of the Russian Federation, to Alaska, today part of the United States. Small groups migrated along the coast or edges of the ice using small boats made of animal skin and driftwood, such as this kayak. This man is likely dressed in a waterproof parka made from the intestines of the seal. Other small groups moved along the icy coastline choked with icebergs, while others found their way into the interior through ice-free corridors, all the while following creatures that were their food source, such as these people who live in Alaska, known as the Inuit, although some call them the Eskimo. Original populations from which American Indians derive from still live in the region of East Asia. Examples include the Chukchi reindeer herders as shown in the photo at the upper right, and the Yupik coastal dwellers shown in the photos below. The man at lower left, by the way, is demonstrating their technique to avoid blindness from the bright rays of sunlight reflected from snow and water. Discoveries and research in recent decades uncovered the entry of early man into North America. One particular discovery in 1996 on the banks of a river in Washington was the skeleton of what was to be called the Kennewick man, who was about 9,000 years old. Analysis of his skull for its facial morphology revealed a resemblance to an early native people of the island of Hokkaido, Japan, known as the Ainu, shown in the photograph, the lower photograph. And sorry that I'm covering part of the guy's face. The Japanese themselves are latecomers to Japan, by the way. These are the original people to Japan. The skull morphology suggests that the earliest Americans looked like early Asians of 9,000 years ago. Pure Ainu are a bearded people with a different look than the majority Japanese or northern Asiatics of Asia today. And incidentally, the Ainu are a disappearing people. When discussing time periods and events of so long ago, we have to use the names of certain time periods, such as the Pleistocene epoch, which is more commonly known as the Ice Age, and that ended about 11,700 years ago. During this time, much of the Earth's water was locked up in these huge continental glaciers and ice caps, so as a consequence, sea levels were lower than they are today. Continental land masses looked like really a lot bigger than they do today, and exposed certain land bridges, such as the one that we are featuring here called Beringia. And it connected Asia with North America. When the Pleistocene epoch ended, a new era began, and that was called the Holocene epoch. It's the name for the present age that we live in. Sea levels began to rise as the ice melted, and this took a long time. As global temperatures rose and the ice began to melt, Beringia disappeared and Siberia and Alaska became distinctly separated like they are now. But there was plenty of time in which early humans went into and out of North America during that time. Whether it was along the coastline as fishermen and hunters of seal, or whether it was overland chasing the migration of mammals, it's likely that the continental interior was jammed with ice, and the first great explorers just kept traveling down the edge of the ice in boats made of animal hide and driftwood. As they went, they would hunt and until they discovered land somewhere down the Pacific coast. I'm going to present two theories and one hypothesis about the migration of people into North America. On this map, ignore the fact that they're all called hypotheses. It's two theories and one hypothesis. Now, the first one is the land bridge theory. The second is the coast migration theory, and the third is the Solutrean hypothesis. The land bridge theory is the idea that ancient man came into North America from about 13,000 to 14,000 years ago. It's well known that the Western Hemisphere was the last set of continents to be populated by human beings. The Clovis people are believed to have come from Siberia, overland through the land bridge of Beringia about 13,500 years ago. So up until about 1975, the overland route was thought to be the only good explanation for how human beings arrived in North America. Before sea levels rose to their present level, it's believed that this immense ice sheet called the Laurentide ice sheet and the Cordillera ice sheet, which is basically a large set of alpine glaciers, that they effectively blocked the overland passage from Alaska to the rest of the North American continent, to the sites that make New Mexico famous, the Folsom and the Clovis sites. Now, continental and alpine glaciers are basically rivers of ice, and they're especially dangerous to cross because they move slowly, and as they move, they break apart, and they leave on their surface dangerous cracks, and they're hidden by fresh snow. Furthermore, they were lifeless expanses that offered no hunting or gathering opportunities for people. But once the corridor opened up, mammals began to migrate back and forth into the lower part of North America and back up into Asia, and hunters followed them, of course. Now, as an aside, it's interesting to note that in the year 1590, the Spanish missionary named Fray José de Acosta presented a cosmological publication, and it was entitled The Natural and Moral History of the Indies, in which are treated the notable things of the sky and elements, metals, plants, and animals therein, and the rituals, ceremonies, laws, government, and wars of the Indians. In this he presented that the most likely pathway for the Indians to have come into the Americas was from Asia, and explorers, including Spanish explorers going up the Pacific coast, kept that in mind as they went along. Well, we're back in New Mexico. This is Clovis Man. So Clovis Man is so named after the location near the city of Clovis, New Mexico, although it's slightly closer to its neighbor Portales, New Mexico. The actual site itself is called Blackwater Draw. Now, it's a drainage trough situated on a vast, flat, semi-arid plain known as the Llano Estacado. So hunters use this trough, or arroyo, as a way to entrap their prey. They drive it into there, corner it, and then they would spear them. Remains of many now extinct animals were found piled up and buried from the action of time at this arroyo, or draw. Along with the bones of extinct bison and other animals listed herein, there were spear points that were lost and left behind by hunters, embedded in the flesh of those dead animals. Their age was ranging from about 10,900 to 11,500 years ago, and it caused great excitement and can be visited today by you if you so choose. What's so clever about the Clovis Point is its design. This invention was made from available flint found at certain locations in the eastern Great Plains. Its bottom mounts effectively on a shaft because it has a convex base in it, and it's often found with at least a short length of fluting to accommodate a wooden shaft. Let me give you some specifics. So fluting is when you knock out and thin out the layer of a shaft going where a shaft will be placed into it. And of course there is the convex base here. So the Clovis points are still called Clovis points even if they're found in other places in North America. The one that I highlighted here at the left, this one was found in Belen, New Mexico. Can you believe it? Now, at the left of this, you can see how this carefully shaped and chipped Clovis point mounts on the shaft, and it's secured with gum and sinew binding, which is the fibrous sinew binding that you can see on these particular samples. Many creatures, such as this mammoth that's shown on the main photograph, are just too large to confront by an individual. But if you get teams of people cooperating, they're led by those with knowledge of the terrain, they could drive collectively some animals into natural hazards, such as bogs, where in unison they could use their weapons to make a kill. Now, let me call your attention to a peculiar device that this man is holding in his arm. What in the world is that? Let's find out. Spear shafts weren't just thrust into an animal by sheer brute force. There was an invention that helped this out. And there was a Mexican anthropologist pictured below at low left. Her name is Zelia Nuttall. And she discussed the thrusting tool and called it an atlat. Atlat. Now I pronounce it again for you, atlat. The name atlat derives from the Nahuatl language of central Mexico, where it was applied to a kind of lever tool that increases the thrusting power of a person's arm. The earliest known example was found in France, dated to around 17,500 years ago, and it was made of a deer's antler. The atlat likely accompanied the Paleolithic people into North America from Asia. So if I were to highlight here, for example, on this one is from a codex of an Aztec codex showing that they were used quite late in time because they were a very excellent invention, even though there was the bow and arrow by this time as well. But in Paleolithic times, there was no bow and arrow. So people use this lever, which of course you have your elbow, you have your wrist, and this is like adding an extra elbow and extra length of your arm, which allows you to thrust in steps 1, 2, and 3, launching at a large creature with increased force. The name in Spanish, tirar con tiradera, jugar con jugadera, or arrojar con arrojadera, is the translation that Zelia provided for atlat, which literally means a thing thrower, a sling thrower. The collection of mammal species of great height and weight are known as the megafauna, and remains are found even in Mexico. The kind of horse that existed was smaller than the horse that was brought from Europe later by the Spanish. There was a giant sloth, a short-faced bear, and other creatures that became extinct long ago. And this was due to two factors: climate change and hunters. A few creatures from that age still exist, such as the smaller version of the Ice Age bison called the American bison, the American elk, the grizzly bear, antelope, and even a smaller version of the armadillo. With my highlighter pen, let me call out some of the creatures. Here's a giant sloth. Here's the head of camelops. Look at this, the American elk. Look at the size of this armadillo or armadillo. And then we have here a pronghorn antelope, the horse that existed back then. Here's Bison Antiquus. Bison Antiquus here. We have dire wolf. Look at the size of this lion here. You got the short-faced bear and what looks like the grizzly bear here. Now, relative to the height of humans, notice how high an imaginary human was by comparison. And these animals were being found, like I say, in Mexico. The largest of the creatures that went extinct was the woolly mammoth that looks like an elephant, but with short ears and an enormous set of tusks, as well as its namesake, that long and thick woolly hair. In the cold climate of the Ice Age and its conclusion, when time changed into what we call the Holocene epoch, there was this kind of a principle that could be applied. It was coined as Bergmann's rule. Bergmann's rule. And it was named after the German biologist Carl Bergmann. This rule holds that a large body retains heat more efficiently, and as the animal's total size may be larger than its smaller counterpart, its surface area may appear to be greater, but not like its volume. It seems counterintuitive, but a larger animal stays warmer because a smaller portion of its surface area is exposed to the cold air. This is why so many Ice Age creatures were so huge, because they have a greater volume to surface area ratio. Another example of this is the Bison Antiquus. This creature is the larger Ice Age version of the present-day American bison. At the conclusion of the Ice Age and the beginning of the Holocene epoch, this massive creature was hunted at great risk by the Paleolithic Indians. They followed the bison's migration in what are today New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Arkansas. Kill sites have been discovered in Oklahoma, where it was evident that small herds of these creatures may have been carefully partitioned from the main herd and driven by teams of people moving through the grass on foot into ravines and over cliffs. If the herd could be persuaded to stampede, the creatures would not have time to take evasive maneuvers. In this way, the Paleolithic people were using the bison herd's own stampede instinct, as well as knowledge of the terrain, to confuse them, corner them, and kill them. During the warming period of the Holocene, bison got smaller, but were still impressively large, but as a consequence not as lumbering as the Bison Antiquus. The camelops. Camelops was an interesting creature because it lived during the Paleocene epoch and became extinct about 10,000 years ago. I can't resist showing you what they look like because it was one of those creatures hunted by a Paleolithic man early on. To the south and west of Santa Fe in a volcanic area, a camelops was walking or trotting along a mudflat, leaving its tracks that were subsequently buried by another eruption of volcanic ash and preserved. And it was made into a visitor's display after its discovery in 1966. But because there was no caretaker and there were incidents of vandalism, this point of interest was deconstructed and the tracks were buried. But they were, for a 2001 study, uncovered, so as you can see here in the photographs. Since the time of the Clovis discovery, new discoveries have been made, and after the mid-70s, new hypotheses were developed in the wake of finding these human remains and artifacts with earlier dates than those of Clovis. These were dates from 13,000 to 14,000 years ago, and they had to be explained somehow. So unfortunately, Clovis, which is in New Mexico, has been dethroned as the earliest evidence of human occupation in North America. I'm going to introduce you to the Solutrean hypothesis. The Solutrean hypothesis presents that humans from Europe could have entered North America by means of boats, following the edges of the polar ice that were at that time quite extensive. Or they could have been going overland, hunting things like in the subarctic, such as seal, or fishing wherever the ice was broken open. Now, although the initial discoveries of the Clovis points were at Clovis, New Mexico, more Clovis points are found in the eastern United States. They are found in the continental United States down to Central America, which is, I'm going to circle it for you here. This is the area of Clovis Point artifacts down to here. Like that. So, it's interesting to point out that they are found in the continental United States and down to Central America like Belize, but they're not found in Alaska. Some suggest that the Clovis Point was invented in North America as a result of this evidence, but it may be based upon a prior design brought in from Europe. It looks different than the European flint points, but with some modification, it could have come over from that direction. Now, most people dismiss that because there's much stronger evidence indicating Asian origin of the people of North and South America. Now, you'll see the reason why it's controversial. It's because it implies that a group of Europeans arrived in North America first. But I'm going to caution you not to think in those terms. Just like the Ainu of Japan, they're descendants of an ancient race in Asia with a different look than today's Asians. So too there may have been a different people in Paleolithic Europe. The Solutrean hypothesis, among other things, presents this similarity of ancient spear points found in the eastern United States to those found in Europe. So here are shown two examples. Europeans living from 9,000 to 15,000 BC were known for their cave paintings. And so a question does arise that although we might find similarities in spear points, such as between the one on the left, which looks a little crude, but it was found near Hampton, Virginia, and the photograph in the center, which is a Solutrean spear point found in Spain, one would have to ask, well, if these migrants brought this technology, let's say they really did cross over the North Atlantic, why wouldn't they have introduced cave paintings into North America? One has to consider that the act of painting, of taking an image from your mind and putting it on a cave wall, from the dreams, from the imagination, from visions that you see while in the darkness, this is all quite a bit of a progress in mankind, because cave paintings are not a feature at that time in North America, but they were in Europe. So it clearly was a leap of advance in the human psyche. Another discovery is the presence of genetic markers. Let me show you one example. Europe and Asia, genetic marker common to both Europe and Asia, appear in the northeastern, in much of the Europe and Asia and even North Africa. That it also appears up here in the northeast of North America, right in here. So would that not imply that there was some kind of connection made through the North Atlantic? The Solutrean hypothesis is not so far-fetched when one considers that people succeeded in finding meat and fish to eat along the subarctic and Arctic regions, which are in a line running like this. So people hunting in those regions, it would have allowed like people from Asia to circle the entire top of the globe. However, the Solutrean hypothesis remains a hypothesis, but it is interesting, and this is just one of several genetic markers that they found that appear in North America that create this unusual belief that there could have been a connection with Northern Europe and Northern Asia rather than Eastern Asia. Okay, so the next hypothesis is much less controversial and, of course, quite reasonable. It holds that pre-Clovis people avoided the icy interior of the North American continent by moving along the coastline in watercraft, such as I talked about previously in this lecture, boats made of driftwood and hide. And so here we have, let's say, people migrated down this way, all the way to, notice I'm going to point out a special place. It's called Monte Verde, Chile. So this is thought to have occurred from between 15,000 to 16,000 years ago. If we would extend the time backward, this would explain why Monte Verde, Chile shows up as such an ancient site. It's currently, I know it says 14,800 years ago on this particular illustration, but scholars have now determined that it could date to 18,500 years ago. So some scientists also believe that, based on such things as DNA evidence, that there were several waves of people who entered the Americas. It wasn't just one migration, it was several over a long span of time. So what did these people look like? I've included here 3 examples, but typically what they do is they find that the skull morphology of the earliest inhabitants to North and South America, they have some variety. In the photograph at right, we have Eva, and she's dated to 13,500 years ago and was found in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. And facial reconstruction revealed her, at least according to the ones interpreting it, to look like people from what we would say Indonesia. At lower right is a skull that was found in the Valley of Mexico, and it was dated to 13,000 years ago. And you can see the bald-headed woman represented here in this model, in this bust. Another was found in Mexico, and it was dated in the range from 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Now, both of them, as reconstructed, have facial characteristics that deviate somewhat from what we would think is a strong-featured American Indian. Even more striking is this example, found in a cave in Brazil, and it dates to about 11,500 years ago. This woman had a morphology of the skull suggesting she resembled an Australian Aborigine. I can give you my opinion. They all suggest thus far, all of these examples, a resemblance to an ancient set of populations that were in Asia. Now, they're not used to what we're seeing here because over thousands of years, a kind of thing we might call genetic drift has occurred, in which people mix and create family for a long period of time that eliminates certain characteristics and augments or makes more emphasized others. So the first inhabitants may have had a set of varieties, and their genetic markers are presently found in people in North and South America that indicate a common branch from an ancient population in Asia. And from that main trunk of migrants, one branch goes into North America and another branch ends up going to, let's say, the Philippines, the islands of Oceania, the Polynesians, Australia, Polynesia, and so forth. So we've got these different populations separating from an early ancestors, which may have carried a different look. And as they reproduce and create family over time, because of limited mate selection, that's what may have caused the different look that many American Indians have today. So take this example. This is a spirit cave man. This was a body of a man found in Nevada, the state of Nevada, in a cave by an ancient lake called Paleo Lake Lahontan, and that'll come up later in this lecture. He had reddish-brown hair and even some skin that was intact. His body was found in 1940 in a cave, and it turned out to be, by the most recent dating methods, to be 9,415 years old. He showed some signs of violence, such as a skull fracture and health problems like abscessed teeth, and he was clearly eating from the lake because they found fish bones in his intestines, because this was an extraordinary find. This body was covered in a kind of reed blanket called made of reeds that were growing by the lake called tule, and there was so much of him preserved, and yet he was so old. It was a very fascinating study of what early humans in North America were looking like. And part of it was that when they did a skull morphology on him, he most resembled that, again, of the Ainu, the ancient Asians that we saw of Japan. It's similar, not necessarily exactly the same. So, skeletal remains of early migrants to the Americas are rare, but when they show up, they're made to be controversial, because there are some people who want to suggest origins other than Asia. Whether there were migrations from Europe is not the issue here. This is looking at history from our perspective now, and we really need to let the finds, these particular finds, they should speak for themselves, for their time. Facial characteristics that we perceive are a product of variety contained in the human genome get singled out by this mate selection from mates who are available from populations that are quite small and widely scattered. So what we may define as race is the product of a given environment, and also that the people have been, over generations of time, finding available mates within limited geographic areas of limited variety. So certain facial characteristics of skin tone, so forth, they get augmented, they get loud, and that's what makes race as a variety of the look, outward appearance of people so diverse on Earth. So genetic testing does suggest that population from a population or set of populations from Asia at that time had genetic characteristics. They could have branched off from main trunks that were in Europe and Asia and broken off to turn into the specialized look of distinct peoples throughout the world, mainly, of course, our topic, North America. For this reason, I'm not ready to completely dismiss the Solutrean hypothesis, and of course, I'm rather proud to embrace the coastal migration hypothesis as a valid one that introduced a variety of ancient peoples from Asia into North America. Now, in this particular example, we have several finds that we've already covered. The Spirit Caveman found in Nevada. Here's another find in the Channel Islands of California. Clearly, a coastal migration people were going down the coast and left evidence of themselves in the Channel Islands. There's Gordon Creek, Colorado. There's Browns Valley, Minnesota. There's Wilson Leonard, Texas here. And then, of course, there's this man that I want to talk to you about. His name is Kennewick Man, here depicted on the left, with a peculiar look found in present-day Washington State. So let's talk a little bit more about him. He's the most controversial among the early human remains found in North America. Kennewick Man was so named after the river that he was found at in Washington State. Now, it's a lengthy story that I won't go into here. You can look it up yourself on Google or Wikipedia or such. But suffice it to say that, like other early human remains in North America, they show signs of violence, as if there were multiple migrations by different Asiatic people, and then some of these encounters were not friendly or for trade, but rather violent. So signs of violence and injury show up on the bones of this man, as an example, and like Spirit Caveman, who has also had injuries. This particular one, I'm going to circle it right here. Notice that there's a rock in a bone. Oh dear, what could that be? Well, what happened is that this man was attacked by a stone spear point driven into his pelvis bone, his hip bone, and he succeeded in pulling it out but broke off the tip, and the tip remained embedded in the bone, and thereafter his pelvic bone started to grow over it. Quite a dramatic story to be found with this man. There's a lot more extensive interpretation about what they found with this skeleton, if you so care to research it further. Let's revisit with more detail the climatic conditions and landscape of the Holocene epoch as it began. So beginning around 11,700 to around 10,000 years ago, temperatures increased to up to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. So melting ice in inland areas from alpine glaciers had already created many inland lakes throughout western North America, including New Mexico. And much later, there will be a warming period in the Anno Domini, that is after Christ, from 800 to 1200 AD. And then there's a cold period that befell the world again, lasting from about AD 1200 to 1850, about 170 years ago. You heard me mention a paleo lake. I want to tell you what it is, what it looks like. Let's clarify it. So during the time of large continental glaciers that existed in North America, such as at the north end of this map right in here, there are these huge areas of cold, icy rivers of ice, glaciers in the mountains. And then there were continental glaciers further north. In the southwest, precipitation was heavier as a consequence. And this is due to the effect of colder winds blowing in moisture from the Pacific, hitting the cold air, which was embodied by these glaciers, and it caused clouds to form and then to drop their moisture in this region. So that contributed to the growth of these lakes. It's condensation from moist air from the Pacific. These vast inland areas of the American West and El Norte Mexicano were subject to downpours, and the other characteristic of the basin and range region is that they had, some of these places, no outlet to the sea. So let me show you now Lake Lochonten, which is here, one of the larger lakes, close to where Spirit Caveman was found. And then we have this lake right here called Lake Bonneville, a huge lake in what is today's state of Utah. And the Great Salt Lake still exists. It's a part of old Lake Bonneville that has not fully dried up. So it's right in here. If you've ever been to Salt Lake City, it is so named from the Great Salt Lake. Then we have Lake Cahuilla, which is right in here. It covers the area of the Mojave Desert, such as Palm Springs, Indio, the Salton Sea, and all of this area down to Calexico. And then we have Lake Cochise. And Lake Cochise is an important name for you to remember for later. Cochise, the Cochise people were an early archaic people that wandered the deserts, mountains, and lakes of the what is now the southwest El Norte Mexicano. They're called the Cochise people. But notice here Lake San Agustin, Lake Estancia, and Lake Otero. All of these three are paleo lakes that existed here in New Mexico. So I'll detail these three last lakes for you shortly, but I just wanted to say that these lakes reached their greatest extent around 30,000 to 12,000 years ago. And the inland lakes would have become the favorite places for the Paleolithic people to fish, to hunt, and to find material other than animal hide to make their clothing and shelter. So here's the Llano San Agustin. It's a broad, flat prairie encircled by mountains in the west central state of New Mexico. It was once a paleo lake that today is dried up, but it still has low-lying playas. Playa is a flat pan area that is usually made of sediment and mud and even sand. And during a heavy downpour in current time, they can accumulate water without any outlet to rivers, to lakes, to other places, to the ocean. So it's in this site. This was in particular was a site of early human habitation, known as the Folsom site, and I'll show you that shortly. But let me show you first Playa Lucero, which is the remnant of a paleo lake that scientists call Paleo Lake Otero in the Tularosa Basin or the Tularosa Valley. Now, from the surrounding mountains, water would run from the mountains down into the valley and bring with it a braid away limestone and gypsum. And so the gypsum and limestone deposits accumulated on the valley floor. And so these crystals that you are seeing in this photograph, these are essentially plates of selenite that have grown by the action of water drying out, and the crystals start to grow ever so slowly in the bed of water where the gypsum had become soluble or dissolved, I should say, in the water. And so as the water is drying out, the mineral is reaccumulating itself and forming and bonding with each other, the molecules, to form these crystals. And they're quite dramatic to see that on Playa Lucero there's so many of these crystals that it grew on them. Now the action of erosion and evaporation eventually left a dry playa, and that was windblown, and from here were built the famous white sand dunes, the Médanos Blancos. So what you're looking at, no, that's not snow, that's white sand. It's gypsum that was windblown from this ancient lake bed. If you've never seen it, you gotta make a trip down there and see it. Paleo Lake Otero is important for you to remember as well, as we discuss shortly the presence of a people in the Tularosa Basin at a site called the Oro Grande site, also known as Pendejo Cave. So let's move on to one other lake called Lake Estancia. Now, Lake Estancia is a pretty interesting lake, and let me quickly introduce you to Google Earth part of it. The part of the lecture that I include Google Earth here. I'm going to zoom into it. So here is Albuquerque, Belen, so you can get perspective. Here's Santa Fe, and south of Santa Fe is a place called the Estancia Valley, and you'll notice this white area here and other white patches here. This is part of the ancient lake, the Paleo Lake Estancia. And as I zoom in, you'll notice the little town of Estancia and Willard here. And I'll zoom in a little further, not too close actually. And I'm going to use my red pen, and I'm going to demarcate this long lake right in here. Right in there. And there's a bunch of smaller ones that are small and round all in here. These lakes are, they're encrusted with alkali and salt. This long one right here is called Laguna del Perro. Laguna del Perro. So Paleo Lake Estancia is about 90 direct miles south of Española, New Mexico. And the Estancia Valley features those mud flats I was showing you. They're essentially, that's what they are, is mud flats. But some of them have quite an accumulation of salt, and others a thin puddling of water on them. Now, the largest of them that I showed you, Laguna del Perro, that one is pretty much a mud flat. But then there's a few of them that are like shown in this inset photograph of La Salina. That one has the best salt. It's an incrustation of salt. I've been down there, and you can scrape it up with a shovel, a snow shovel. It's that thick. This area, incidentally, this lake, is a source of the salt for the people who lived in New Mexico during the Spanish colonial times. So Pueblo Indians and Spanish settlers both formed these caravans, and they would make their way south. In particular, this area is 90 miles south of Española, so they would go in caravans for protection from the Apaches, and they would harvest the salt and bring it back, and it was very necessary for life and for living. For example, meat without refrigeration spoils unless you salt it. So this is the Oro Grande site, excavated by Richard McNeish for a few seasons beginning in 1993. It was called by his team Pendejo Cave. Rather rude word in Spanish, but it's at this place they found a single human hair, dated from between, they found out 12,400 and 12,200 years ago. Although there's much to discuss about this place, I wish to point out, in brief, that this place is very remote and dry. It's located in a limestone landscape. It's inaccessible to the public because it's embraced by a military reservation as well. But signs that this place was once wetter are found in the discovery of remains in this cave of squash, a kernel of corn, a 10-row corn cob, a husk of corn dating to 2,900 to 1,600 years ago. But date ranges in the layers go all the way back to 55,000 years ago. Now, in the northeastern part of the state of New Mexico, there was found a site near the town of Folsom, New Mexico. There was the remains of a Bison Antiquus with spear points in it, dated to about 8,500 BC, or 10,500 years ago. Now, the Folsom point is decidedly it's a smaller spearhead than the Clovis points that we reviewed earlier in this lecture. This site in particular was discovered initially in 1908 by a black cowboy. His name was George McJunkin, and he had experience working other outfits, other ranches, and he saw what bison skeletons should look like. But this one was rather strange. He correctly deduced that it belonged to an extinct variety of bison, Bison Antiquus. There was an unusually heavy downpour that gouged out an arroyo, and so it exposed these bones, and when they excavated, they found the Folsom points. Now, let's look at the time scale of lithics. Lithics is a discussion about spear points or arrow points. In this time scale, you can see that where the Folsom point falls, 10,500 years before present. It falls in relation to the other ones, progression of chipped and worked lithics that are in descending order of time, getting smaller and smaller. So as time progresses, you'll see that from the Paleolithic, I'll point it out here because the words might be very small for you to read. It says early Paleo-Indian, 11,500 to 10,800 years ago. Middle Paleo-Indian, 10,800 to 10,500 years ago. And right in here, 10,500 is our Folsom point, right in here. And then we get into the late Paleo-Indian, 10,000 to 500 to 10,000 before present. We keep progressing, 10,000 to 8,000 years before present, and then up here is 8,000 years before present. And notice they're shrinking. All of the points are shrinking smaller and smaller. Well, why would this be? It's because large beasts, the megafauna, had become extinct. And game is getting progressively smaller and smaller. So, but 10,500 years ago, however, New Mexico still had herds of Bison Antiquus roaming about. So let's have a look at Sandia Cave Man. Sandia Cave Man featured, among other things, the appearance of the Folsom Point. This is the closest site to us here in Española, New Mexico. It's the site close to Albuquerque. There's the Sierra Sandia, there's Bernalillo, and then there's this small town called Placitas. And near Placitas in the mountains is this canyon called a stream runs through it called Rito de las Huertas, south of Placitas, New Mexico. So it's open to the public. Last I heard, there is a constructed catwalk. There's no interpretation to the site really, or very much, but you can walk along the cliff with the assistance of this metal catwalk that takes you to the cave entrance. And notice the cave here was heavily graffitied and vandalized. It's been cleaned up considerably. Their volunteers and other people went in there to clean the place up and restore it back to what it should look like. So in what they found in here was the Folsom points, bits of woven material, and bones of creatures that are now extinct, including this cute little horse, the Pleistocene horse. So let's revisit the place I told you about earlier. It's the Paleo Lake of today's Llano de San Agustin, also known as the San Agustin Plains. 10,000 years ago, it was a favorite site to live, to hunt wildlife and birds coming to drink, and to fish. As shown in the photo, this truck is at the edge of what would have been the lake's edge. And the lake's edge would have had lots of reeds and marshes, and it's now just a dry playa and prairie. So archaeologists were going about on the edge, and they were finding Clovis points and Folsom sites all along these shorelines and marshes, which showed that the nomadic people were probably using this place as a seasonal residence. They called it the Ake Folsom site, or Ake Folsom sites plural, so named after the ranch owner, or the family that owns it. The study was initiated here because they were preparing to build this huge radio telescope research center, and they needed to probe the area for archaeological sites before damaging them irreparably with the new construction. And that's what led to this discovery of the Ake Folsom sites. Let us now summarize some of the highlights of this lecture. Early mankind entered the Americas most likely by coastal migration and land migration through Beringia. Multiple migrations took place. Facial features of the earliest Paleo-Indians differed somewhat from American Indians later in time, who resemble later northern Asiatics, as the Ice Age transitioned to the Holocene epoch. Perhaps some friendly intermarriage, perhaps unfriendly or forced encounters occur. Other than genocidal encounters, dominant groups absorb others, and genetic drift occurs. Megafauna, such as the mammoth and Bison Antiquus, were hunted using Clovis spear points thrust by the atlat. The megafauna go extinct due to climate change and human involvement. Fauna gets smaller and nimbler, and stone points on hunting weapons are made smaller. Folsom man arises 10,900 to 10,200 years ago. Folsom points, which are smaller than Clovis points, are used. New Mexico has the distinction of having major discoveries of artifacts of Clovis and Folsom people, whose namesakes are derived from New Mexico place names. This concludes the lecture on the first migrants to the Americas and the Paleolithic Indians of the Southwest El Norte Mexicano and New Mexico.